Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We're all about creators, and today we have an interesting collaboration going on between two creators. Here they come to the screen, Beth Magnetic and Masterpiece, who everybody knows as Ron Yorgason. And so welcome to the show.
Thanks,
Hi, everyone.
Beth.
Thank you.
So I thought we would get a little bit about each of you, and I guess ladies can go first and tell you like a 2-3 minute sort of story of your life and how you got to maybe to the place where you maybe even met Ron or whatever.
Yeah, so I grew up in the church. I was a very devoutly believing member of the church from the time I was born. I am from polygamous, heritage and whatnot. My great-grandparents my great-grandmother was like the first baby that was born in the Mexican colony that they were in back in the polygamous days.
Like Colonial Juarez or something?
Yep. I'd have to look at which one it is specifically, but yeah, she was in the colonies. And so my family is very, very Mormon. So just to give you a hint of how Mormon they are, my parents met Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow at the Preparing a People conference down here in Arizona, which was the second event Chad and Lori were at together. So that's how Mormon they are. For those of you who are into Mormon True Crime, my mom's cousin is Jason Mao, who was friends with Lori Vallow, and she used him. He was a police officer. Used him to explain why they needed to not worry about her being a bad person. So that's how Mormon my family is. They are in the radicalized region of Mormondom. I got married in the temple, in the Mesa temple, and I went through the endowment session and I walked into the celestial room and I turned to my family and I said, I see why they say we're in a cult now. And my whole family laughed and shushed me. That definitely was the cracking of the shelf began then. I wound up pregnant with I went through some infertility and experienced that experience in the church of being treated less than as a woman because of not having a baby. I did eventually get pregnant. And while I was pregnant, I ended up realizing that I love my baby more than God loves me. I could never, not want my baby around me because they're not perfect. And so that really started the ball rolling. And I read a book that is called Toxic Parents. And there was a line that said, an abuser will control their victim down to the underwear that they wear. And that completely rocked my world. And
Wow.
So, yeah, right. And so I took off my garments shortly after that and learned about Joseph Smith's polyandry and just how much we had been lied to. I ended up finding out that I ended up becoming diagnosed with bipolar this past 2 Decembers ago. I also have an autism and ADHD diagnosis. So I'm neurospicy and deal with mental illness. And so I've experienced the church through the lens of mental illness, which is why I love to talk about true crime, because everybody is like, oh, hey, you can't talk about that because they did that because they're not mentally ill, not Mormon. And so I think it's really important to talk about that. But anyway, I got divorced about 2 years ago, and I started a Facebook group called Ex-Mormon Divorcees, where I met Ron Yorgason. We just started chatting, and we ended up just having so much passion for Mormonism, Mormon history, that type of thing. He's been such an insane resource of history, quotes, information for everything that I do with Mormon True Crime.
He's like a well that will never go dry.
Insane, amazing.
Perfect. I get that's the segue for you.
All right. I also grew up in the church. Polygamous lines go all the way back on both sides of my family. My great-great-great-grandfather was John Taylor on my mom's side. My dad's side, they got another polygamist blood from Sweden. It goes all the way back to Pioneer Heritage. Born in Utah, escaped when I was 5 and grew up in the mission field.
I thought you were going to say in the jungle.
So I grew up in Wisconsin and moved around in various places. I went on a mission to Alaska in 95, 96. And I was really all in. I was so Mormon. I got probably around my junior year in high school, I got really, really into everything. I became a very devout seminary student. I I was the master or the scripture mastery champion in my senior year, and I was really into everything. And I served a mini mission before my mission, so I did like 2 weeks in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I was all in. My MTC teacher was James Stoddard III, who was later the founder of the Joseph Smith Foundation. I just remember at the MTC, he just knew everything, and I was so amazed at his knowledge. He was totally a scripture giant, and I wanted to be just like him. So on my mission, I'm getting all these books. There was actually a church bookstore in Anchorage, and I never had one in Wisconsin. So I was always, every chance I had to go by there and visit, I'd get some more books. And I was always getting books by the prophets and things, and reading those on my mission. So I got really into learning a lot and really doing everything that I could. I followed the church plan to a T. I came home and got married with like a year and a half later and started having kids immediately. So I have 5 kids, followed everything that the church told me to do. And it was really, really hard. Finally, during about 7 years ago, we moved to Ohio, 7, 8 years ago, and we had a small farm. So I got a new job that was very high demand. I was in a religion that was high demand. I had 4 kids that were teenagers that had activities, and we were in a small branch. So I'm taking them.
High demand.
It was busy. And then I got called as elders quorum president. So I was so tired, completely burned out. And my friends that I used to home teach in North Carolina were kind of talking about polygamy and some experiences and some of the history in there. And like, well, I come from polygamous blood on both sides. I know all about church history. I've been to all the church sites and I've read a lot of the church history books. So I know church history. I mean, I've done it all, and I tried explaining some of the polygamy reasoning to these people, because they clearly just didn't know it, and I did, because
So you started out defending the faith.
Of course. And they're like, well, they just read up a little bit on it sometime. And so after a couple of months, I see some other Facebook post or some post I'm talking about a polygamous book, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'll finally get a book and read this. And this was one of it was a Joseph Smith fought polygamy style book. So that was my first introduction to really learning about any of this. And I'm reading how Brigham Young hijacked the religion and out from underneath Joseph and was practicing polygamy and all sorts of things behind Joseph's back. And I start freaking out. I'm like, what the heck is this? I've never seen anything. I've never heard anything like this. And
I want to jump in here. One of the proponents of this we've also had on the show, her name is Michelle Stone, and she's got a very successful podcast that's also around this theory. But for viewers who may not be aware, I just want to give a quick summary that the idea that polygamy was not started by Joseph, but was actually this massive conspiracy started. Basically, everyone around him, all of his friends and enemies, all agree on this one thing. Very conveniently and coincidentally, that it was just it was all Brigham Young. He's the bad guy here, and every bad thing we've ever heard about Joseph Smith really came from Brigham. It's not mainstream. It's not what the LDS Church teaches in its own history and essays, even though it hid Joseph's polygamy for a long time. For, I guess, certain generations, it never denied it. And especially early on after Joseph's death, that was actually one of the main splits that happened between the mainstream Brighamite sect that ended up in Utah versus the Church of Christ, which also used to be the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because they were very staunchly anti-polygamy, whereas obviously the Mormons were not. So that's my quick 5-minute rundown of this theory. And so that's where you started, which is
where I started.
So Ron, were you thinking, Ron, that some of this stuff they must be overtelling it, but there's got to be some truth in it, but a lot of it might be anti-Mormon lies or anti-whatever the history or did you think that this was just a clearer retelling of what actually might have happened? Well, how did you approach it?
Well, they had some good sources and everything. So they're talking about the Cochranites that Brigham Young would come in contact to, and then they had the William Clayton diaries from his mission in England. So he's doing these mission services, and then there was these women there that were not his wife that would come and minister to him and wash his feet. And then like the next paragraph or two would be blanked out. It would be all scribbled out, so you couldn't see what happened. And they kind of showed this pattern over and over again in William's diary. And I'm like, holy crap, this is really freaky. And I still don't know a good explanation for that. But yeah, it's kind of weird that I hope that they have the technology that they could go back and decipher what was actually written originally in those journals. And I hope they do that sometime and
and so that got you inspired that there must be other juicy sources, right? There must be more information even out there.
Yeah. So I went back to
you got to lead to Beth.
I went back to my friends and I told them about what I was learning in this book, and they're like, that sounds kind of sketchy. I recommend Year of Polygamy by Lindsay Hansen Park, this In Sacred Loneliness. And so I started listening to that, and I started reading the book, and I started like, oh, okay, so some of these other more established versions of history look a little more reasonable. I still don't know everything about what could be there with the Joseph polygamy. I think there's a lot of evidence showing that Joseph definitely did start it. So anyway,
what was the tipping point?
It shook me enough that I could go through and I could take a step back and say, okay, so maybe there is something wrong with this religion, the things that I wasn't told, and I really dove in to find out all the stuff that I never did find out. So within a couple of months, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is really shady. There's a lot of crap in here that I never learned about because I was supposed to know it all. I read all the church books and everything, and I was supposed to be an expert. And here I am learning that I didn't really know anything. The only thing that was kind of holding me on was some religious experiences I had, so I couldn't quite explain those. One night, I'm finally reading through the CES letter, and I've already learned most of the stuff in there, but kind of seeing it all in one place. And then at the end, it showed a link to a video that was very similar to that Spiritual Witnesses video that has all the people testifying that of their spiritual experiences that let them all know that their religion was true. And I'm like, oh crap, these spiritual experiences, these feelings that I had aren't what I thought they were. And that was really the night that just severed my last tie to Mormonism. So I wept for the passing of my old life, and then I started fresh and tried to figure out everything that I do need to work on, and what is my whole life just shattered. So I had to piece everything together.
Pushback from the church and your family?
I resigned from being Elders Quorum president. My wife didn't really want to know much about it. My kids didn't want to know much about it. My oldest son followed me out a few months later as I was telling him all the crazy things I was learning. And finally he's like, holy crap, my dad isn't crazy. There really is something really wonky with this religion. So he kind of followed me out. Yeah, my marriage was already kind of shaky, and that was kind of the death knells to it. We moved out here to Idaho hoping we could kind of start fresh, and that didn't work. But so I'm stuck out here in the middle of rural Idaho surrounded by Mormons, newly single, and yeah, it's fun trying to find dates out here.
Then you met Beth.
Yeah, and I met Beth through the Ex-Mormon Divorce group, and so anyway, I got really into history. I found a obvious plant picture. It was a book that was shown on a website somewhere that was said, "Meet me in the sex barn." It was a romance novel, smut novel, with a couple that are obviously in a seductive pose, and the barn in the background. I thought that sounds just like Joseph Smith and Fanny. We need to write a smut novel with all the polygamy and all the stuff going on. And that got me thinking about Nauvoo and how great it would be to have like a series of books about Nauvoo. So I got all sorts of books on history, and I got really into this even more. And my library is now just exploded, and I have Mormon history just completely fascinates me. It's not like anything we'd ever learned in church. I think one of the greatest sins the church did was making Mormon history very boring. And they kind of teach you a very watered down, whitewashed version of Mormon history. And you hear the same stories over and over again. So you think you know everything because you've heard all the same stories, and it's very boring and bland and very all faith promoting. And you get in there and you find out that it's a lot dirtier, a lot grittier, and way more fascinating. So I just absolutely love Mormon history and finding all the stuff that they never told us and sharing that with others.
I have one question. So when you were in Alaska as a missionary, was it common to say many are cold but few are frozen?
Yes, that was the motto.
I had a question for Beth, actually, about your family and just how radical they are. I just wonder if they've changed anything since the trials of Lori and Chad Daybell, or if what was their response to that?
So after Lori and Chad were arrested, my family, they were just like, oh yeah. My family actually didn't tell me that they met Lori and Chad until after Chad was just convicted. Like, they just barely told me that they met them.
Wow.
They had told me they were at the event with them, but they didn't tell me they met them until just now. They've distanced themselves a little bit, but my family is just naturally very into the radicalized version of Mormonism. So Jason Mao actually used my laptop to host an event because, it was right after COVID began and nobody knew how to use Zoom that was in that generation. And so they needed me to help them set up this thing so that he could host a virtual event. So my family, they are always going that kind of have that prepper mindset. My dad has always walked around like, I can't wait until I die and I get to go be with God again. Like, he doesn't even care about the fact that he's alive right now because he just can't wait to die and be with God.
That's sad.
It is.
That is too sad. So,
I think
so you guys meet online, and what happens from there? So you just let us know how to get to where you're going to collaborate.
So we were just, I would always mention like this, that, or the other true crime case. And Ron would send me like, oh, hey, you should use this quote. Hey, you should tell this story. Hey, did you know this piece? Right. And so Ron was constantly giving me like all of these things. I knew that in context, in the grander scheme, I could see how somebody like Ruby Franke took the teachings of obedience and how obedience is the first law of heaven, and about perfect obedience. I could see these types of things and see how she got there. But then Ron would suddenly...
It's like taking a magnifying glass to the teachings and burning a hole in something.
Yeah. And so Ron would be able to like just suddenly like produce a quote or a reference or a story from church history that I had never heard of, or that I hadn't even considered. It's the way that it just so specifically shows what the belief is on a more precise level. And so Ron just was doing this over and over and over and over. And so I had done the episode on the Daybells, and I just kind of asked Ron if he would be willing to do an episode with me, because I'd seen, he'd done episodes with Mormonish. So I asked him if he would do an episode with me on the Daybells, on the theology behind the Daybells. And it ended up being 5 hours worth of us talking about the deep theologies, doctrines, context behind how
there's
did
so
Chad.
There's so much there. Yeah.
We could do another 5 hours. For sure.
Yeah. And we like to promote other people's content. And so what's the name of your channel? And we'll provide a link for our viewers.
Mormon True Crime.
Mormon True Crime. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Ron just started this, Word document and starts plugging in, I don't know, what was it, 27 pages or something of quotes and references and stories and this type of thing, where all of a sudden, like, we're able to show, Chad isn't outside of Mormonism by using a pendulum, because guess what? Brigham Young had a bloodstone amulet, and Joseph Smith had a Jupiter talisman, and Hiram Smith had a Mars dagger, right? So a pendulum is not crazy when you have casket canes that have the blood of the prophets on them that you believe that you can cure people with. Anyway, so yeah, we just ended up doing that, and so then I've also asked Ron if he'll help me speed up the timeline of putting out a book by 5+ years, because he already has all of the references organized, sorted out, and ready to go.
That's right. I was kind of a Mormon because I had a lucky rabbit's foot keychain and I had a little baby troll to protect me somehow. So that's my Jupiter talisman sort of thing that I just did just from being an American. I don't know, whatever.
Yes, exactly. It's really interesting once you actually start to learn the history and see that, like, literally, aside from the word zombies, Chad didn't make it up, right? And so I've never seen a rating scale, and I haven't heard the word zombie, but literally everything else that he did, I can find historical context for how he got there.
Ron, did you want to jump in and add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I for the Daybells, when I first heard about them, I heard about their ideas on reincarnation. I'm like, well, that's not even close to Mormon. I don't know where that came from. These guys are just completely out in left field. And then I found out that actually there is a lot of history on reincarnation, stemming back to Joseph Smith with the Kabbalist teachings that he was sharing with his wives and close associates and everything else. And we got the Apostle Orson F. Whitney, who was a firm believer in reincarnation and tried really hard to make that official church doctrine and was shot down by the other core members. It was fascinating on just learning just how much theology, Mormon theology, underpinned what Chad Daybell was teaching. So,
I remember seeing somewhere that they actually had a scripture committee as part of the church in the 1830s, where they would discuss what should be scripture or not, and that could be a reason why the Pearl of Great Price wasn't in the scriptures. It shocked me that it wasn't until the 1880s that the Pearl of Great Price was put in as a scripture, since it obviously was a translation of the Book of Abraham from Abraham's own hand.
Yeah, and it's just interesting that one of the things that we don't really talk about, or when I was LDS, we didn't talk about the school of the prophets and how Joseph Smith was teaching obscure random things in the background. And so everybody's sitting here like condemning Chad, saying like, oh, this isn't Mormon because he was teaching these things secretly in these private meetings. Guess where he got that? Joseph Smith, right? It was this historical thing that they would meet and share these deep doctrines and secret things and secret ceremonies. Polygamy was happening in secret, and all of those ceremonies were happening in secret. So all of a sudden we're having a weird time with the fact that Chad Daybell is doing prayer circles to cast out demons, and they're just calling it castings, right? So they combined energy work, sure, with those things, but the roots of it can all be found in Mormonism.
Well, Beth actually gave me an idea, and what that is maybe there were a few secret groups, because when you think about it, how many splinter Mormon groups there were in the 1830s, and as soon as Joseph Smith was murdered, there were more splinter groups. It almost makes you think that maybe there were different groups that heard different versions of what the Mormon church was, and when things started to change under Brigham Young or other things, as things would go along, that they would just move on and get their own groups, their own study groups together from those circles and start another version of the church, like either the Church of Christ or other things that happen.
And Ron
I think the church has tried to prevent this a number of times. Little kind of, I heard it used to be called like cottage groups or even study groups. Just any time a group of members gets together, even at mainstream as you go, to start kind of diving into scripture study. And this happens because the church curriculum just really isn't cutting it. It's very boring for a lot of members. And when you're excited about the gospel and you want to research and dig in, I think it's very normal and natural for these kinds of groups to form or for friends to want to study together. But it just, and not always, that these don't always end up in obscure cults, but it happens a lot, it more than you would think, and it's been a problem for the church. And so the church really tries to put a kibosh on that and prevent groups
And I
from
think
forming
maybe
a
the
highly
Lafferty
secured-
brothers had a little bit to do with the emphasis during our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the other things is that they talk so much about milk before meat, right? And that church is the place to discuss milk. That you're going to just learn the basics. We're going to talk about these same lessons. We're going to talk about Jesus. We're going to talk about the Book of Mormon. We're going to talk about Joseph Smith. We're going to just talk about these same things in church over and over and over. Meanwhile, there are the mysteries of God that are talked about, and there is meat that's talked about. And the only safe place to have those conversations is not in church. So if the church wants to actually have Mormonism be safer, they need to facilitate these conversations about the meat, where they can talk about things like blood atonement, and that even though it says on the church website that blood atonement is the atonement through Jesus Christ, that's not what blood atonement is. That if Chad Daybell had a quote unquote safe place to discuss the meat inside church, where people knew that he was considering these dangerous ideas, and we could have been talking about meat in church,
Right.
then they would have a better hold on this.
The good meat and the rotten meat. But my son, Derek, I'm going to give him a plug here. He came up about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe about 3 years ago, that the essence of non-consent is milk before meat. If you don't know what the milk is, you haven't been taught,
Yeah.
right? And we think about the missionary discussions where it's all milk, and then, or maybe even not even milk, watered down milk. And then you go to the every 4-year schedule where it's, okay, 2% milk now. And then you go to the temple. Okay, it's 4% milk now.
It's never,
It's never meat. It's never cream. It's just whatever will keep people in the longest.
So the only place to discuss and get to that meat is outside in these fringe groups that happen outside of the supervision of the church.
And it's exciting to make up a bunch of stuff based on scriptures. People have been doing it for thousands of years.
So when we were doing research for the Daybells, I found all the scriptures and all these quotes from prophets and apostles about the mysteries of God and how we're supposed to seek out the mysteries, how the other Christians sects didn't have any of the real information. So only in Mormonism can you really get the real meat of the gospel. And so they encourage you. They tell you to look for and find the meat, and you can get it all. You can get additional meat through revelation. So
even praying in the temple.
Yeah, when you read all the stuff that has been taught by the prophets and apostles, you can go get your own revelation through God. So they give you all these channels, and they encourage you to go seek out these mysteries until the church has been bit enough times by people finding these mysteries and going way off in the boonies, and now they only prescribe milk and they don't let you find any meat. Right.
They're so shunning the meat nowadays. They're actually probably going to put crosses on the temples pretty soon. And, I predict that it's going to be called the Mormon Catholic Church someday, because apparently Good Friday and Palm Sunday are something that we've always, celebrated. And so.
But without the word Mormon, because that's a victory for Satan, obviously.
There you go. Well, the next prophet will probably bring it back. So that's what
Decently possible, yes. So where are we next in the journey or the story?
So I'm continuing to work on the Mormon True Crime podcast, recording stories. So I have about 80 different stories that people have recommended or that I've found where either it was committed by a Mormon, or the victim was Mormon, or there's just some major Mormon element to these cases. And so I'm working on that. And also Ron and I are working on the Mormon True Crime book together. And yeah, one of the big things for me is making sure that we start to have better conversations around mental illness in Mormonism, because so many of these cases that I've talked about, so the Kaneko family from Rexburg, Idaho, for example, they had some major scrupulosity and OCD. There was also schizoaffective bipolar type, and that was in play with that family. And the mom and the daughter, and the dad, they all became extremely radicalized, but the mom and the daughter became so extremely radicalized, they starved themselves to death. And then the dad lived in the home in Rexburg, 7 minutes south of where Chad Daybell ended up living later. He lived with their dead bodies for 3 years and a year and a half, based on when they died. And these cases are happening. They are going to continue to happen. They will not stop happening. And the church needs to start doing the things that are going to keep these in check and decrease this. No, we can't stop it all the time. And no, mental illness isn't the church's fault. But when they have these systems that feed mental illness the way that it does,
yeah,
some of the blood is on their hands.
And we need to backtrack a little bit because you talked about
I jump on that
starting
before we backtrack a little bit? I just wanted to say this is something that I do see and hear a lot of. I think mental illness is something it involves trauma, and so I feel like maybe all of us have the potential to I guess to have even if we're not diagnosed with anything, we all have the potential, I think, to fall into mental illness or to become mentally ill, just like we can physically. I think there's kind of this idea that it's mostly genetic, which that's part of it, just like with our physical bodies, but things can happen in our lives that kind of injure our mind and our thinking the way that our bodies can be injured physically. And so I do think that, for people who are predisposed, it does seem like church doctrines can really just light a fire under something that's already there and just cause it to expand. And I do wonder sometimes if it it can also affect people, I guess, or introduce that first little spark in some people who otherwise may not have been radicalized or would have been fine, and not. I do feel like the church is the first push for some, but that might be more. I don't know, Beth. I don't know if that's more controversial, and I'm fine being really soft on that. This is just what I'm hearing.
I'm not soft.
Yeah, something I'm okay thinking about, but for sure, it can exacerbate almost any mental illness. I don't think there's anything that Mormonism I have not seen made worse, from image issues to bipolar narcissism to this like extreme radical fundamentalism, to the point. This is a new story for me I haven't heard, but to starve yourself to death. I've heard of people doing that. I'm not familiar with this particular story, but it's really wild. And yeah, it's sad. And I do hope that the church, we can change and we can, get this. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, the way that I've described it is that, yeah, the mental illness was there, but the mental illness latches onto Mormonism, and there's terrible things for mental illness to latch onto inside of Mormonism.
That's right. A lot of people say that, there are bad people in every group.
I get that
The
every day.
Daybells are just bad people. They could have been Catholic, they could have been Buddhist, and it still would have happened. It's like,
but they weren't. They were
when
Mormon.
you plan the murders in the temple via text, you're kind of not in a Buddhist temple, really. You're at a Mormon temple. So there's something there.
When multiple mortal probations and spirit prison and light versus dark and all of these theologies showed up in the crimes that are traced back to Mormonism, you can't say that Mormonism had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, that and the Laffertys was all about Mormon theology. Everything that they did was all underlying about that. So the Mormonism gives you a lot of dangerous theologies that you can use to convince people that you're doing something wrong, using religious reasons to convince them that it's right. And so,
and there's no prophetic pronouncements. Like, at least the Catholic Church has the papal edicts, right? There seems to be a lacking. You could go to a conference and hear like 3 different viewpoints of how to follow Jesus or how to do, some aspect of the church.
In the same conference, even.
In the same conference.
Absolutely.
Well, as long as the Book of Mormon still has the story of Nephi killing Laban at the very beginning, it's better for one man to die than a nation to perish in unbelief. Anybody who thinks that they're doing some special work for God and there's somebody in their way preventing them, it's better for that person to die than for their special mission to fail.
That's right.
I was just talking to Ron about this yesterday, but Doctrine and Covenants 132, it specifically says that if a woman doesn't let her husband marry a subsequent wife, that first wife should be destroyed. So are we, why are we shocked that Chad Daybell, who has shown that he is in the words of his daughter, traditional Mormon, who looks to Brigham Young, who looks to Joseph Smith, that he felt justified in destroying his wife? It is literally in the scriptures.
Yeah, my wife would hate when I would read that to her every week.
So
yes, back to when did you start to think maybe there's a book here? What was there a moment or just?
So for me, it actually began one night with friends around the table. We were drinking White Claw, and I started talking about Ted Bundy and how Ted Bundy was like the first personal brand, and I talked about how religion. One of the things that he did was he made himself Mormon so that he could blend in with the community and not look like a threat, and how so many people are that way. And so anyway, yeah, for me, it just began several years ago. I was like, one day, you could ask all of my friends. I've been talking about doing a true crime podcast for probably 6 years now. And finally started to do it. I, got divorced. And so it doesn't impact my ex-husband now if I'm talking about Mormon true crime. So I've gone in on that. But I've known for several years now that like I need to write a book about Mormonism and true crime, because I can't even begin to tell you guys, there's so many insane cases that even if it's not something that's so radicalized like the Daybells, there's the Haight family down in Enoch, who he felt that like he's the patriarch of the family and he's not going to let his family be a burden. So he massacred his whole family.
Or leave him.
Yeah, because it's his job to make sure that they're an eternal family. Yeah. So they can't leave him because they're supposed to be together forever, right? And so even if it's not radicalized, it could still be extremist.
That's right. And so you went back to the well of everlasting water and said, Ron, come and help me.
Exactly. No, I just was texting him and then I was like, okay, listen, it could take me like 5+ years to write this book, or you can put some quotes in a document for me and we can do this.
Between the two of you, do you see some themes with either types of crime or maybe even the stories or justifications that they use from Mormon doctrine? Or has there been anything that's kind of surprised you or you've learned as you've been covering these stories? That what insights have you had as you guys have done this?
So Maven wants like footnotes, just like in the scriptures, how all these things are connected to scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the wild things you're going to get are coming from blood atonement, polygamy, or some. Those are some of the most dangerous ones. So anybody who decides to go back and start looking for the meat, they're going to find out that all these quotes from church leaders saying you can't make it to the highest level of the celestial kingdom unless you are participating in polygamy, and then you'll see scriptures that say God will always support you as long as you're righteous, and he never won't give a command unless he provides a way to follow it. And how we're not supposed to fear man, we're supposed to fear God. And then you read Wilford Woodruff's proclamation in 1890, and it's all about fear. So it's saying, if we don't do this, if we don't stop polygamy, the government's going to take all of our money. They're going to take our temples. They're going to be putting us in jail. It's all about fear of what man can do. So it's very much a very easy step to go from these are the teachings from the original prophets, and these are the promises of God, and then looking at Wilford Woodruff's proclamation and saying he's doing this out of fear. This doesn't look like it's a real thing. And so they can very easily say that they should be following polygamy still. They should still be following some of these other doctrines, and the church has gone astray, and that they need to be following one of these more fundamental things. So the people that really, really want to be obedient, they really want to be in a solid Mormon, they want to find all of this meat, they want to be the best Mormons they can, and they find out that the LDS church doesn't support the best version of Mormon that they used to teach. So it's very easy to follow into these other polygamist groups, and then you get things like Ervil LeBaron, who says, okay, well, we've got these other rival groups and there are people that are apostatizing, and then we've got teachings of Brigham Young on the blood atonement. So these are people that need to be blood atoned, and get rid of some of these people that are in my way. And you're going to have these types of things over and over again because the church doesn't really go back and discredit previous teachings. They've kind of done we've got polygamy and blood atonement that they've kind of backed away from, but
and Adam God,
the doctrines are still there. But a lot of other things that they've taught in the past 100, 150 years, they just stop teaching and hope that no one notices anymore. And so they're all still there, and they're
that's
all
right. It's almost like the closer you get to the Mormon meat, there's a slaughterhouse nearby.
Yeah. So we're going to have these crimes over and over again. It's going to keep happening because people will still become radicalized, find these old doctrines. They're going to get revelation. They're going to believe the things that the old prophets.
So they're the one mighty and strong.
Yes, the one mighty and strong is going to be happening over and over again.
It's not me.
No,
Not yet.
I'm so sorry. The other thing is there's Josiah Gibbs. So Josiah Gibbs, he wrote the first pamphlet booklet on Mountain Meadows Massacre. So he writes this book. It's about 70 some odd pages, and it's basically an expose that Mountain Meadows Massacre occurred. So and it details some of the context and that type of thing. In his introduction to this booklet, he talks about the fact that Mormonism, the Mormon church needs to fix two big things. First off, they need to quit having the persecution complex. They need to start telling their contributions to the stories about the things that they talk about. You know, like they talk about the Hans Mill Massacre, but they don't talk about what they did before the Hans Mill Massacre, right? And so they talk about all of these ways that they've been persecuted, or that even to this day, you know, they Mormons online act like Beth Magnetic is persecuting them by saying that all Mormons are murderers. That's not what I'm saying. Okay. So first off, they have to get rid of the persecution complex. That has to go, because as long as they have that complex, they cannot hear what they've done. They cannot hear what any member has done. They cannot hear the reality of these stories and situations. The second thing that they have to do is they have to cut out the follow the prophet speaks for God, never question the prophet. When the prophet speaks, the thinking is done. They have to stop that attitude, because you know, I was raised with that. And I know that kids today are still being raised that we follow the prophet no matter what. Great. Which prophet? Okay, so now we go back to Brigham Young and we follow the prophet. But the prophet said that it's okay to behead someone because they're in an interracial marriage. We stopped following the prophet when, right? And so there's a serial killer, Israel Keys, who his family left the church, and I believe that they left the church in 1978 when Black people received the priesthood, and they went and joined white supremacist cults because the church had fallen away from the truth. And then he was raised in these extremely militant white supremacist groups, and then he went on to be a horrific serial killer. And so even though he wasn't
I didn't
raised
know he
in
had
the
a Mormon
church,
connection. I think I've missed that.
Yeah. So even though he wasn't raised in the church, his family had been raised with the anti-government, the anti-medicine, and the racist doctrines of Mormonism, and they went to white supremacist groups that would perpetuate and continue that belief system for them.
Wow. So how many true crime groupings are there going to be in your book?
So we're actually doing it like a choose your own adventure book. So we aren't necessarily going to have like the family annihilators and child abuse and that type of thing. It's actually going to be that the reader, they are coming in and they are an apprentice to a private investigator. And the FBI has commissioned them to figure out, why are so many Mormon true crimes happening? And so they're going to learn about all of these different doctrines, histories, stories, that type of thing, through what will be a series of interviews in a choose your own adventure format.
Which reminds me almost the Laffertys, the Lafferty movie. What was that movie called?
Oh,
Under the Banner of Heaven.
Under the Banner of Heaven. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So Under the Banner of Heaven was like that for the police officer, the investigator.
Yes.
What was his name? Pyrie?
Yeah, that sounds right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so he had to go through sort of those stages. And I think there was a big red book that taught him a lot of the things that might be issues with Mormonism, and caused him to pause and think about.
Actually is foundation there.
Yeah. And that book is available online in a PDF, I believe. I'm pretty sure that one is Mormonism, Shadow or Reality. Is that the title?
Right.
Or Shadow of Reality? Something like that. Yeah.
We could provide a link to that. But actually, also, how many different crimes are there? How many different?
I've found over 80 so far, but I keep finding very obscure ones that nobody's heard of, nobody's talked about. So like there's Patrick Tissier in France, he was a convicted murderer, and he had assaulted people and been convicted of it as well. So he was convicted of that. He got out of prison, and then he joined the Mormon Church, and he was embraced in his ward. The kids called him Uncle Patrick, and he was so incredibly close to this ward that when he kidnapped and murdered an 8-year-old from his ward, her mom couldn't believe it, because no, he's the nicest man. So the church allowed a convicted murderer and rapist to be engaged in his ward with children, and one of the children from the ward died from it. And so this is like a case that nobody is talking about. You can only find it in French. So I'm having to use Google Translate to learn the story. There's tons and tons and tons of cases like that people are reaching out and they're like, hey, by the way, my grandma murdered my grandpa. Like these types of things that nobody's talking about. And so at the moment, 80, but I have a feeling it's going to be much, much, much higher.
If you had said 19, I would have been, wow, that's way more than I have ever heard of. Times by 4, and maybe even 5, is still a very, very large number.
It's unreal.
And I think in Utah especially, but I could see this also happening elsewhere, where where Mormonism is so small that it's not well known, that it wouldn't be a detail necessarily reported in the public. And in Utah, for sure, are less likely to put Mormon or LDS. In fact, they do seem to go to great lengths to use very generic words like, congregation when it's a ward that somebody's from. If they have to mention something about church, like if it happened at church or they met through, they really make it as generic as possible, so it's not obvious that this was a Mormon bishop, that committed this offense, or that it happened in a Mormon chapel, these kinds of things. And so, and I'm just thinking too of floodlit.org, which is trying to kind of put together a database of abuse cases in the church, mostly child abuse, but any abuse. That's kind of what they had noticed as well, and that was the impetus for them to start this database as well, was to kind of see that sometimes this Mormon lead, this Mormon connection and Mormon cover-ups were being buried in the news stories. And so they wanted to have one place where you could go to find out, find these things. And so that's what it made me think of. I'm sure the same. I mean, child abuse is crime, so it's definitely connected there. But I think what you're doing is a great thing. Yeah.
I think what we're going to title this is The Mormon Connection to True Crime.
Yes.
That sounds
And
great.
That's what it should be.
Mm-hmm.
So on the same thing there, Maven, I was just reading last week about a starting of a serial murderer. He was picked up a girl. He was an 18-year-old. He picked up a girl in Bountiful and took her to a park, and then he pulled out a knife and he started stabbing her. She was able to get out of the car and escape, and other people came and helped her out. And he ran off, found another older lady walking down the street, and he attacked her with a knife. And again, he was scared off, and they eventually caught him, and he was arrested. And I guess they finally sentenced him to what I don't know how long it was sentenced for, but I think it was just in the news that he just barely finished his sentencing, or the trial, was found guilty. I tried to find any information on his Mormon status. All I could find was that he was from Utah County, and there's like a huge purge of anything about this kid before this time. So I was able to find his name and people that were related to him and family members, and I could find some Facebook accounts showing them in temple settings or things along those lines. So I could find that he was raised LDS, but it was no article would ever mention anything about it. I couldn't find hardly anything about the kid. No witnesses would come forth and say, "Oh yeah, I knew this guy from so and so." But any other place you find a crime like this, you're going to find people that knew the person and talk about him and his past, and there was nothing at all anywhere about this kid that was killing people.
Interesting.
So
not scripturally based, as far as you know yet. But you wonder.
He was definitely raised Mormon, and I think that they've purged any reference to him being.
So I've seen this quite a bit, actually, just in the last maybe couple of years, is anytime a member of the church is committing crime, all of a sudden their social media is shut down and gone. So this is just my conspiracy theory. There's no proof that I have for this. But my belief is that the church probably reaches, Curtin McConkie probably reaches out and has them shut down, wipe out, and erase every ounce of evidence that they can that this person was connected to the church. So we saw this happen down here in Arizona with the Gilbert Goons, where at least two of the teens involved with the Gilbert Goons came from Mormon families. I don't believe that they were actually practicing Mormons themselves, but they did come from Mormon families, and all of a sudden their families' social media was locked down, could not find anything to connect them to the church.
I think that the church actually wouldn't even need to go as far as to reach out with the law firm, honestly, because the control the church has over its members, even if the teens were not practicing, if their grandma, if their aunts, if their parents, the church would just it would be easy. I was going to say strong arm. It would be easy for the church to strong arm their family members, but the church wouldn't even have to go as far as to strong arm them. Honestly, just their local leader could just come and kindly say
agree.
it, and
I think it might be a conscious choice on the PR law side of the church.
Somebody is definitely
to give
reaching
that
out
direction
to the family, I think, to ask them to shut it down rather than corporate law firm to Facebook or something like that. But somewhere maybe law firm to
the family,
stake president,
the
to bishop, to family, something like that. Absolutely, I can.
And also, like you mentioned, the persecution complex would cause people to not want bad news to get out, to give ammunition for more persecution or whatever.
Yeah.
Instead of realizing that, sunlight is the best disinfectant sometimes or whatever.
The church owns a massive media empire, so they'll own a lot of the news stations and newspapers. So it doesn't take much to make sure that they get good press and to keep out anything inconvenient.
It's
That's
like
right.
how they have in their footnote that does mention blood atonement. They talk about the anti-Mormon rhetoric in the Salt Lake Tribune that that mentions blood atonement, and that this was just something that the Salt Lake Tribune used to make the church look bad.
I only practice blood atonement when I'm preparing a barbecue.
If only that's all that it meant. Yeah.
So I guess we're just about ready to wrap up, right?
Yeah.
Does anybody have any last words they want to say?
Or final thoughts? Last words sounds ominous. Maybe in a true crime podcast. Let's get some closing thoughts.
That's right. Not good for a true crime episode.
I really liked what you said, though, Jean, about sunlight is the best disinfectant. And we have to talk about these things, and we do have to start saying that, yes, Mormonism did contribute. You know, everybody talks about, like, well, why are people so into true crime? Why are people into true crime? They're into it because they want to understand what was the psychological process that led someone to commit these crimes so we can prevent it in the future. So the fact that we're sitting here pretending that this religion that rules everybody down to their underwear would not have any influence on somebody committing the crimes that, you know, we talk about at Mormon True Crime, that's absurd to me. And so if we're going to actually dig into and try to understand the psyche, try to understand the thought process of these criminals, we cannot pretend that religion didn't play a role in it. Because if we do not start paying attention to what has happened in the past, it will continue to happen again.
You have any final thoughts, Ron? Or
I love telling stories and bringing awareness of all the history of the church that's been hidden. And I love finding ways that I can help share this information and make it well known. And so I'm always looking for new opportunities to do something like that. I'm planning on starting a new channel where I'll be telling in kind of in this environment with my pipe, and I'll be telling interesting stories from church history. So look for opportunities or look for things like that for me in the future. So
awesome.
That's right.
Well, thanks, guys.
And now you're under the magnetic power of Beth. You can't get away from her, right?
She's definitely helping me with my business plan and plans for that. So I'm very grateful for that. So we're helping each other out.
Yes, it's fantastic.
So you're doing the collaboration together for this one project, and then it's going to help you on both of your other individual projects. That is a really good. That should happen more. It's almost like it takes a village to make a podcast or write a book.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody for watching today. Have a great summer. Like and subscribe. And in our description, you can find some of the references to the things we've talked about. And also there's a tip jar if you appreciate Maven's work or something I might have said. If I gave you a chuckle, feel free to just even look at it, we'll say. You don't even have to donate, but just look at it. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.